first will be Nadine Neighbor, Assistant Professor of American Culture and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. She's the author of a forthcoming book on Arab San Franciscans. The second is Ronald Stockton, Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He will be speaking about gender differences in the aftermath of September 11. Among his publications is something I've always admired, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a high school curriculum unit that is, he tells me, is on the internet. Thirdly, Jenan Ghazal Reed, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of California. She has just been named a Carnegie Scholar for 2006. Professor Neighbor.
Thank you, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for having us here for this wonderful event. This essay focuses on the narratives of a group of young women who identify as Arab American, feminist, and activist. The narratives I explore emerged out of ethnographic fieldwork in San Francisco, California between January 1998 and August 2001. Two organizations were central to my research participants' activism: the Arab Women's Solidarity Association and the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee San Francisco chapters. There's a lot of historical context that I think is really important to my analysis, but because of my time, I don't want to spend the whole time giving you the history of San Francisco and political activism, but I just want to point out that San Francisco is a bit different than a lot of the other contexts that we've heard about today because of the history of the civil rights movement there, the history of radicalism, and the kind of California being a hotbed of multiracial politics. So I think that's just important to keep in mind. Also, the particular context of the period that I'm writing this in was around the emergence of the Second Intifada in Palestine, which ignited a kind of a period of increasing visibility for Arab American activists in San Francisco, as things had been quite dead for a while. And that particular period meant that there was an increasing integration of the Palestinian issue and the issue of anti-Arab racism within the racial justice movement and the anti-war movement in San Francisco. Alongside of that, Arab American feminists, women who had been working alongside Arab American men within Arab American community organizations, felt a growing need for a feminist space to address specifically their role as women and feminists within larger community politics and struggles. So that's just a bit of a background. Arab American feminist activism during this period emerged on multiple fronts. One, in terms of strengthening Arab American women's spaces through events that were by and for Arab American women, such as events entitled Speaking for Ourselves. Another location of this kind of political work was in terms of bringing an analysis of gender justice to progressive Arab American community organizations. And that took place, for example, in a billboard campaign against the US-led sanctions on Iraq in the 90s, where a series of grassroots events that incorporated gender justice into a discussion of US politics in the Arab world. Grassroots organizers raised $20,000 to put up billboards on the freeways in San Francisco that had a picture of an Iraqi girl, and the billboard said, "Sanctions are destroying our generation." The third site is in critiquing dominant notions of feminism that represent Arab women as passive victims of violent misogynist Arab men. So another side of struggle here is within feminist politics and challenging dominant notions of feminism. And for the other side of struggle for these young women is bringing Arab American women's voices into radical women of color theory and practice. And that took place, for example, and you could see that in terms of the late 90s was the first time that this really important organization, the Women of Color Resource Center in Berkeley, California, added Arab women to their board, and same with the national leading women of color organization, Insight Women of Color Against Violence, added 2 Arab women onto their board in the late 90s. So again, that's just a little bit of a background. And none of what I'm going to say today emerges in a vacuum. The work that these young women are doing comes out of is building on the history of the activism of other Arab women in the US, and is linked to national Arab American organizing. So clearly I'm talking here about radical political social movements. I'm not talking about electoral politics. And I use the term a radical Arab American feminist critique as a shorthand for the kind of politics that I'm talking about. It's a particular movement of Arab women activists working in the grassroots political movements that are considered progressive or even radical, such as racial justice, anti-war, Palestinian liberation, or women of color movements. While diverse, a common set of loyalties link my research participants together, including a commitment to dismantling the intersecting axes of power, racism, and sexism, and a commitment to Palestinian national liberation from a feminist perspective. Also, a commitment to a politics of visibility, particularly among women of color feminist movements. Thus, I will argue that my research participants' critique of power and oppression cannot be captured fully by looking at race and gender separately. And that's basically one of my main arguments here. So the paper has 3 parts, and I'm going to summarize it. The first part is going to explore what I mean by racialized gender, or the inseparability of race and gender oppression that comes out of their work. The second part of the paper talks about the politics of visibility, which is how do they craft what do they mean by visibility, and what are the sites within which they are attempting to claim a political voice? And the third part of the paper deals with visions for transformation. What are some of their claims? What are some of the ways that they craft notions of cultural citizenship or belonging? Racialized gender. And I have a lot of definitions of race that I'm not going to go into for the sake of time. Transgressing colonialist feminism. Underlying my research participants' narratives is the view that dominant feminism in the US homogenizes the oppression of Arab women and constructs a hierarchy between first world women and third world women based on the notion that the Arab woman is a singular monolithic subject of Western feminism. Central to their narratives was a commitment to defining and naming the ways that hegemonic feminisms have co-opted the meaning systems that underlie colonialist US state discourses that construct Arab women as victims of violent misogynist Arab men. According to this logic, while US state discourses call for American men saving Arab women from Arab men, colonialist feminisms call for white feminists saving Arab women from Arab men. Consider the following quote. Laura, I was in women's studies in the late 80s, and it was all about white women who were the liberal feminist types married to white male lawyers. I remember one day there was a white woman who was a guest speaker. She was talking about female genital mutilation. I was the only Arab in the class. I never heard of it before, and she was saying how it happens in the Arab world in Africa. I raised my hand and asked, where does this happen in the Arab world? Can you give us some more specific information on this? She named some countries, and I said, you know, I don't know about this. What are you talking about? I went to her and said again, I want to know more about where you're getting this information. She looked at me in front of the others and said, go home and ask your mother. I was so angry. That was when I first understood about their kind of feminism, and that class taught me how certain kinds of women had the market on feminism. A critique of the particularity within transgressing colonialist feminisms, which represent the category Arab women as a monolith, entailed exposing the interconnection between US-led imperialism and the experiences of Arab women, and stressing also the diverse experiences of Arab women. And I don't have time to go into examples, but a lot of the work that's coming out from these women, for example, there's a conference gathering coming up in June 9th to 11th called Amwaj, Arab Movement of Women Arising for Justice, organized in Chicago. A lot of their organizing is about specifically exposing those links and also exposing the diverse experiences of Arab women. Another critique of that is central to their work is critiquing objectification in the form of tokenism and exoticism. Let's see. I'm looking at the clock and it's going by really fast. Critiques of objectification. For example, Arab women activists expressed that as Arab issues became increasingly visible in San Francisco politics, particular NGOs would insist on inviting an Arab woman speaker to be part of their commitment, to inclusion, bridge building, and diversity. Yet in doing so, NGO activists who operated within the meaning systems of liberal multiculturalism policed the boundaries of acceptable speech, particularly when speakers sought to hold the state and institutions that support structural inequalities acceptable. For example, people would be invited to speak on Arab culture, but would not be invited to speak on, let's say, state policies that target Arab immigrants. Or you saw this post 9/11, there was a focus in the discourses on diversity and tolerance, a focus on discussions on hate crimes with less focus on detentions and deportations and the war in Iraq. As Seema put it, mainstream activism makes sure they have their one Arab person there to speak about diversity. I would get introduced as, she's a Palestinian woman. Like, A, that's a warning, don't talk about certain things, and B, we've got our token, and that's about people not really hearing what I have to say, but having me there as a token, which usually means don't say any crazy radical stuff. You're here and that's enough. Don't step out of your little box. So anyway, just summarizing this section is a term that I use, which is acceptable Arab women's speech. That there's kind of a box that a lot of these women talk about that determines the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Acceptable Arab women's speech played out in gender terms, where Yumna explains, progressive folks make sure they have their one Arab person there, and it's usually a lot safer if it's a woman, because of those stereotypical concerns that Arab men are dominating, barbaric, non-communicative, and they oppress their women. In this sense, Arab American women activists come to occupy a privileged position vis-a-vis Arab men in that they are perceived to provide more safety and comfort within liberal multicultural spaces. Here, objectivity operates by reinforcing the notion of Arab men's agency vis-a-vis Arab women's passivity, meaning that in dominant discourses, Arab men are often constructed as agents of terrorism, and Arab women are often constructed as passive victims of Arab men or extensions of the terrorists. And for example, in my research on post 9/11, a lot of young women who were harassed in schools would explain that some of the harassment would take the form of, Usama's your daddy, you know, are you Saddam's sister? So it was more that they were kinship extensions of Arab male terrorists as opposed to agents of violence. Not that we're all striving to be agents of violence, but it still reproduces the notion of men as agents and women as passive. Just going to skip a bit here. Another key theme within their work is the struggle over invisibility and visibility, which has to do with the way that the racial bifurcation within the feminist movement in the US kind of distinguishes between white feminism and women of color feminisms. And especially in the 90s, I mean, after September 11th, it was more and more acceptable for Arab American women to identify as women of color. But before September 11th, there was this sense that young Arab American women struggled in terms of identifying as women of color because they experienced racism, but not being seen as or accepted as women of color because of Arab American kind of ambiguous racial positioning in the US between the categories white and non-white. This young woman talks about being in a class, a women's studies class, where the teacher said, I only want the women of color to introduce themselves because that's a space rarely given to us. And then she didn't know what to do. She said, I'm Lebanese. I knew I was Arab. I know I'm Lebanese, but she didn't know what to do in that context. And an Egyptian woman said, my name is Muna and I'm Egyptian. So she had identified as a woman of color. And at that point, the point of the story is that this young woman goes through a process of then claiming the category woman of color and finding that it provides her tools for participating in kind of anti-racist discourses and responding to anti-Arab racism through the category woman of color. Here, visibility and political voice entails transgressing the misleadingly tidy 5-part U.S. Census categorization that identifies women of color as African American, Asian American, Native American, and Latina. So that becomes a central part of their struggle, is to transgress the way that Arab Americans are excluded from discussions on racialized communities. Sexism in the community. Sexism within Arab American organizations was another critical site of feminist struggle. Yet while binary, here I want to argue that often within discussions on Arab American feminism, a binary is constructed between the notion that Arab American women face racism outside the home and sexism inside the home. And that kind of reproduces a binary between the public and the private. And in my work, I'm trying to argue that sexism in the home is often constituted by racism outside the home. And racism outside the home is constituted by sexism. And so I want to challenge the notion that it's racism outside the home and sexism inside the home. And I'll give you some examples. Let's see. So there's lots of stories of women talking about sexism in Arab American organizations. This other woman talking about her community where her mother's friends say, "Why are you an activist? Because it gives you something to do because mishmit joza, you're not married." Or my mother will say, "Why do you talk about these issues? People will think you're a feminist or a lesbian." And then she goes on, "Most activist women are single. We're not only single, but we're seen as unmarriable, too strong. It's a high price to pay to be an Arab American feminist. Some men may admire it or appreciate it, but they don't want to marry someone who's their equal. Most of the activist men don't want to marry us. It's as if our outspokenness in some way, it's like we're not vulnerable. We don't have emotions of women anymore. We're these super duper humanoid activists that go around confronting oppression. So we get marginalized and erased out of the picture of marriage." For queer women, it's even worse. There are quite a few lesbian activists, and the stereotypes they're faced with, if they're out as lesbians, they're seen as super sexual, whereas the rest of us somehow are not sexual. We're virgins till the day we marry. They're already fetishized, the queer women. But the whole thing about it is, of course, they're going to be political. The stereotype is that they hate men, and there's a way in which the activist women, whether they're lesbian or not, get kind of tied into that. Somehow we're ambiguous. Like, is she an activist because she went to school, or is she an activist because she's really one of those lesbians? Sexism is exacerbated within historical moments when the community considers itself to be in crisis, and this is where the public-private binary kind of collapses. In this sense, activist women carry the allegory of the birth of the nation precisely because addressing women's demands for equality might evoke a weak link within because there's such a pressure for the community to unify in the face of racism that exposing gender discrimination women often get constructed as being a traitor to their communities. So here a nationalist logic emerges that marks women feminists as traitors to the community. Throughout my field sites, communal and familial forms of power often refuted racism and the pressures of assimilation by calling for a preservation of an authentic Arab cultural identity. Here, the ideal of reproducing cultural identity in the US was gendered and placed on daughters. A daughter's rejection of an idealized notion of Arab womanhood could signify cultural loss. Communal notions of gender and sexuality were located within the context of immigrant attempts to produce alternatives to the universalizing tendencies of US nationalism, the pressures of assimilation, and the gendered racialization of Arab women and men. Thus, we can then challenge the notion that it's racism outside the home and sexism inside the home, and these two struggles are separate. So let me just close by summarizing really quickly 3 points about what some of the claims that some of these young radical Arab American feminists are making. One of the claims that they're making is that there's a consensus that calling for national liberation in the context of Palestine is a feminist act. And that's a resistance to kind of a dominant feminist notion in the US that assumes that work performed under the rubric of nation, race, or class is should be on the back burner of feminist projects. So there's a notion that women who work in nationalist liberation movements are seen as not quite feminist. So that's kind of one of their claims. Another claim is to craft culturally specific methodologies. And I'm really summarizing here. An example of this are women who are challenging, for example, dominant feminist notions of how to address issues of domestic violence within Arab American communities. And rather than taking the dominant feminist model, which assumes that, for example, that would create a battered women's shelter or pull a woman away from her community, the approach here in this one story that I have is a woman who actually tries to work with the community, with religious leaders, and develop a model of community accountability when it comes to domestic violence so that women could stay connected to their communities but also challenge domestic violence. And another example is a woman who's queer and wants to, and doesn't want to cut ties with her family, which is often the dominant model within the US around coming out. And for her, she says, I'm getting married to a gay Arab man and having a baby. For so long, I felt separation from my family was the only way to be queer and Arab. But then I learned that separation from my family doesn't work for me. And finally, just in closing, that there are these kind of binaries that are constructed where dominant cultural ideals in the Arab community, as they see it, is that that being a feminist is being a traitor. And in the US, a dominant binary is that it's an oxymoron to be an Arab feminist, because the idea is that Arab women are passive victims. And so I think in closing, one of the kind of, goals of some of the work that is happening is to challenge those binaries and create spaces where one can be an Arab and a feminist. And for example, the upcoming gathering Amwaj is an example of that. And I think I need to close, right? So I'll just close by saying that for these young women, they cannot split their political energy between either an anti-sexism or an anti-racism political ideology without splitting themselves and being disempowered. So I'll just close with that. Thank you very much.
There's a handout that goes with this. It's not necessary that you have it, but if you don't have it, this nice person here will give you one if you'll stick up your hand. So, today I'm going to present some results from the Detroit Arab American Study. This is the most comprehensive, in-depth public opinion study ever done of Arab Americans. We interviewed 1,016 people from the three-county Detroit area. We also did a companion study of 508 people from the general population asking mostly the same questions. Respondents were chosen by scientific sampling techniques. The interviews averaged 80 minutes and were done by trained bilingual interviewers. Many of the questions were drawn from the classics of social research, but others were created to address situations unique in the community. The Russell Sage Foundation funded the project, and the Carnegie Foundation provided supplementary support. There are 7 researchers on the team, myself being one, and for anyone who is interested, our data is now in the public domain, and anybody who wants to use it for their own dissertations or books or whatever, that's available through the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan. There are certain things a survey can do and certain things it cannot do. And I'm pleased that Michael Suleiman mentioned the distinction between individual participation and community acceptance. I'm focusing on that first part. Survey research has 2 advantages in particular. First, it has the advantage of breadth. It covers the whole community, not just that part that the researcher knows best. Secondly, it frees us from our preconceptions. I remember as a struggling graduate student, I was having trouble making a paper come out the way I wanted it to, and my professor said to me, let the data speak to you. That's what you have to do with survey research. Numbers can't tell everything, but they tell us something that we cannot learn otherwise. And sometimes they get us away from something we know to be true, but are not quite sure we know it to be true, except that everybody says it's true. So it frees us to form conclusions based on data. Let me start by asking you to think about the anticipated participation patterns in two very different Arab American communities. The first community is primarily an immigrant community with 78% of its adults born overseas, 86% do not speak English in the home, and 63% get their news from overseas via satellite dishes. A full half think an Arab or Muslim accused of terrorism could not receive a fair trial in the U.S. Would such a community even participate in American politics? Now consider a second community. 78% are citizens, 86% say they feel at home in America, 91% say they're proud to be an American, and 86% say they have confidence in the local police. Would these people not be at the head of every parade? Of course, the question is a trick. These two communities are not two at all, but are one, reflecting the data from our study. If the responses seem to defy simple answers, then indeed they defy simple answers. I've been asked to focus my talk upon gender differences. The approach in my written paper is much broader than gender, focusing upon participation patterns in their various dimensions. Anyone who wants the full paper can email me, rstock@umich.edu. The way political scientists analyze public opinion data is to begin with what we know about those people who are not in the study. In other words, what is the national pattern, and especially what is the theory behind what we have found in the past and expect to find in this case. What we know about participation in general is that certain types of participation, such as voting, are linked to position in society. And by the way, this was historically not true. Those who are educated, wealthy, and own property are more likely to vote. Level of information is also a major factor, and being a male seems to play a role. Other types of participation, such as involvement in community groups locally oriented, are not nearly so dependent upon these class factors. To an extent, these two types of participation operate independently. Writing your representative and getting involved in the PTA require very different skills and very different orientations to the political system. Here is the research question. What is the pattern of participation in the Arab American community? What drives participation? And do different patterns of participation overlap or operate separately? A second thing we know is that in an immigrant community, the congregation plays a key role. Churches and mosques are really religio-ethnic groups, typically drawing from sub-elements of the community. As such, they help people engage American society, but also empower them to resist those elements of society that treat them unfairly. Research in the black community is particularly helpful in this regard. The black community is similar to Arab Americans in that both are somewhat marginalized and both share a strong sense of group identity. The black churches have traditionally done two things for their members. First, they encourage positive engagement with society, telling people to vote and organize and participate. Second, they created an oppositional consciousness, I'm borrowing this phrase from Harris, telling people that their community is treated unfairly and that they should try to change the situation. Here's the research question. Does this same pattern prevail in the Arab American community? The third thing we know is that participation patterns by gender have their own dynamic. Burns et al. Did the definitive study on this, and I have followed their key bit of advice. They said we should not think of men and women as categories, but should reconceptualize the question. Male and female participation patterns are not homogeneous, but represent two bell-shaped curves whose means do not overlap. In other words, there is a range of male participation patterns and a range of female participation patterns, with men generally more involved than women, but with both exhibiting both high and low patterns. We have been told that Arabs have a patriarchal society in which women are inhibited in their pursuit of the public arena. Our president has told us that the American armies in Iraq and Afghanistan are acting partially to promote women's rights. Here's the research question. Do Arab American gender patterns follow the national pattern, or is there a distinct Arab pattern? What did I find? There are four major findings. First, Arab Americans have a definite participation deficit compared with the general population. So if you look at Table 1, you'll see it there. The first two columns of Table 1 show this. That compares Arab Americans with the general population. DAAS, that's Arab Americans, and DAS, that's the general population. Whether it is voting, following the news, having a party preference, or being involved in the PTA, Arabs are less engaged than the general public. Second, when we look at how different types of participation are related, we see confirmation of the national pattern of a disconnect. In Table 2, voting is highly correlated with signing a petition, sending money to a political cause. You'll have to take a while to look that over, so don't necessarily waste your time trying to figure it out now. But voting is highly correlated with signing a petition, sending money to a political cause, or writing to an official. There is also a class interest cluster. We ask whether respondents were involved in any business or professional group. That could involve everything from shopkeepers to attorneys to import-export firms. Whatever it means, it empowers and charges other relationships. Those active in such associations are active at high levels in almost every other area. Now look at Table 3. Looking at the political act of voting and the locally oriented act of being involved in the PTA. Here the expected patterns appear very clearly. Income, education, and business ownership correlate highly with whether one voted, but much less highly with PTA involvement. In three areas, information, own a business, and trust people, the pattern runs in the same direction for both men and women. But these traits are much stronger in pushing voting than in pushing PTA involvement. Being married, living in the Dearborn Enclave, where 2/3 of all the Muslims in southeast Michigan live, within about a 5-mile circle of my house, and being female sustain PTA activities. Clearly, these two types of activities call upon different resources and different types of people. Third, what role does religious activity play in political involvement? There is a term that academics use called social capital. It involves those things that make us stronger citizens. It involves self-confidence, trust in society, commitment, engagement. It has two dimensions. Putnam is the major researcher on this. He calls these bonding and bridging. Bonding pulls together homogeneous populations around their shared identity. Muslims, whatever they may be, people from Iraq, those would be linked together. Bridging pulls together diverse populations into common purposes. If bonding leads to bridging, then society benefits. But what Putnam calls the dark side of social capital occurs when bonding becomes less integrative than separatist. Here is the research question. Does religious involvement lead to wider social engagement or to separatism? Table 4 offers some answers with comparisons to the general population. You might want to look that one over afterwards to go through it because it's very interesting. Clearly, religious institutions push individuals into the political and public arena. Religiously active individuals are more involved overall and more likely to be participants in the political arena. They are more likely to feel a part of the country and to affirm what is often called the civic religion, the belief that this is a land of equal opportunity that should generate pride. They are also more likely to have doubts about the fairness of the legal system, to resist any restrictions on civil liberties, and to feel that there is a hostile environment in which Arab Americans are not fully respected. These numbers show, in combination, that Arab religious organizations tend to generate social capital that involves both bonding and bridging. To a lesser extent, they promote both an oppositional consciousness and support for the civil religion. In other words, Arabs fit the pattern very nicely. Finally, what do we find about gender? Table 1, columns 4 and 5, show that men and women are remarkably similar in many ways. I call this a pattern of minimal differences. They are similar in whether they are citizens, are fluent in English, watch television news, read an Arabic newspaper, perceive that the media is unfriendly, and follow the war on terror. They are equally likely to feel at home in America, to identify with the country, and to feel that this is a land of equal opportunity. They have similar partisan identifications and similar ideological orientations. In an unpublished analysis of gender experiences and perspectives in the aftermath of September 11th, and that was actually the title of my original title of my paper, I found a remarkable absence of differences in this significant area. Men and women were within a few percentage points of each other in terms of whether they had a bad experience after September 11th. Jan Terry mentioned this finding. 15% had a bad experience, men and women, and whether they had a supportive experience, 34%. I really thought men would have more bad experiences being out and about in the neighborhood, and women would have less, and it just didn't emerge. Regarding the security mom hypothesis, that women were more worried about safety than men, there is some support, but it's mixed. Women were 7% more likely to say that September 11th had shaken their sense of security, and 11% more likely to say that the Iraq War had shaken their sense of security. Still, men and women were nearly identical in their willingness to compromise civil liberties to enhance security. Women and men both have high levels of confidence in local institutions, such as the police, the schools, and the legal system, and were equally trusting of people in general. Now, just for your interest, this is not relevant to my paper, really, but it's of interest to you. On cultural issues, women and men, again, are very similar. Women were 19% more likely to say that premarital sex was never justified, 59% and 79%, and slightly more likely to say that women should dress modestly, but otherwise similar to men on topics including gambling, abortion, alcohol use, and several other questions that we asked. The big gender difference, and it is big, involves those resources that drive participation. Women are 30% less likely to work outside of the home, much less likely to have a firm educational qualifications. They're in serious deficit in media consumption. They're significantly less likely to read a daily newspaper or get news from the internet. Regarding information, women were 27% less likely to know the name of Attorney General John Ashcroft, at a time when everybody, I thought, knew that name, at least every Arab American, and 16% less likely to know the majority party. To be honest, these findings are not surprising. Burns found that men were 14% more likely to know the name of their senator than women. While we should not overgeneralize, the expectation that men are more likely than women to have a public life appears to have support in this data. But the big question remains, what drives participation by gender? Table 5 shows what drives men and women into the voting booth. Now, I'm going to give you some missing numbers for those of you who like numbers, and you can just write the 5 minutes. Great, I only need a couple. So write this outside, write this to the right of the variables, and you can think this through later. Male and female, I'm going to give you some percentages for male and female. Education, 0.318 and 0.324. Income, 0.410, 0.259. Read newspapers, 0.331, 0.329. Identify major party, 0.222, 0.240. Working outside the home, 0.082, 0.064. English fluency, 0.264, 0.362. The patterns are remarkably similar and track national trends. Being possessed of critical political resources, education, income, information, pushes involvement. All patterns are highly significant at the 0.000 level, except work outside the home, which doesn't affect either men or women. Male voting appears to be more influenced by income level, female voting more by English fluency, and you can see this by the correlation coefficients. But otherwise, these are very similar stories. Anyone looking for an Arab effect in this data will have to look long and hard to find it. Arab Americans are different from the general population in their statistical means, just as men are different from women in their statistical means. But by and large, what drives anyone away from those means into higher participation rates or into lower participation rates is very similar for all population groups analyzed in this paper. If you're looking for a headline to summarize these findings, I suggest the following. Arab Americans, history different, situation different, participation patterns boringly normal.
I think you may have to slide.
Right.
Let's see. Well, they couldn't have fit two papers better back to back, and Ron and I have not talked at all during this process, but I think what I'm going to be talking about today dovetails very nicely. And you'll notice the title of my talk has changed from what you have in the program, and that's because back when I was invited by Flip back in November, I was working on the Carnegie proposal and wanted to include gender but hadn't thought about it yet, so it was sort of, well, I'll look at gender differences. Well, now I sort of know the answer, and sort of, as he said, they're boringly normal. I'll explain what I mean by they're more of a bridge than a gap between men and women. So I'm going to focus on two things today. The first question is, to what extent are there differences in men's and women's political ideologies and in their behaviors among Arab American Muslims? So specifically, I'm going to look at what Arab American men and women think about political participation in the American political system, and two, what they actually do, their activities and their voting patterns. So what they think and what they do. But what do we know for Muslim Americans? Well, shockingly little. According to the 2004 Pew Research Center, there's sort of a widespread belief among the American populace that being Muslim is equated with being a Muslim fundamentalist, and that is essentially undemocratic. You can't be a devout Muslim and also uphold democratic ideals. And so, to give you some specific numbers, 42% of people polled felt that most Muslims are anti-American, and that's not just Muslims in the U.S., Muslims worldwide. 37% had an unfavorable view of Islam, and 46% felt that Islam is more likely to encourage violence. So the idea basically is that there's something about being Muslim that doesn't equate with sort of being part of a democratic system such that we have here in the U.S. today. The problem is there's really no empirical evidence that's been brought to bear on this question to date, either to corroborate these ideas or to challenge them. So hopefully I'm going to shed some light on that today. And then more broadly, beyond just sort of the Muslim case, I want to argue that our understanding of how religion influences political engagement needs to be pushed further. Typically we think about, well, if you attend church, mosque, synagogue, something about that increases your political participation. But there's not been a lot done on what are the mechanisms. So what is it about religion that increases an immigrant's likelihood of participating in the political process? And I'm going to argue specifically that there's different components of religious identity and that these can have differing effects on political engagement. Until we understand how these three different things overlap and interact, we won't completely understand Muslim American political engagement. So specifically, and I'll give you some concrete examples of what I mean by these, I'm going to talk about subjective dimensions of religiosity, which I call things like frequency of prayer, how important religion is in your daily life, sort of the internalization of religion and the importance of religion. The second is the organizational aspects of religion, and that's how often you attend, for this case, the mosque, how involved you are in mosque activities outside of just attending prayer services. And then the third dimension, which other research has talked about, is the more political dimension, to the extent to which you feel that your religious group should be mobilizing on behalf of the group. So, and I'll show you how these sort of play out with some data in a few minutes. Bringing it back to the gender question. So just to sort of situate why we're going to look at Arab American gender differences, let me give you a sort of context in what to expect. What we know in the U.S. is that there's high female participation but low representation. So in 2004, women outvoted men, and this has been true since 1980. And this is of all eligible voters. This is citizens, basically. If you look at registered voters, the number are higher, but the gap's the same. In other words, 74% of registered voted women and 71% of registered voted men actually turned out in the 2004 elections. So women are more likely to vote, but not surprisingly, and these are the highest numbers in history, only 13% of the Senate and 15% of the House of Representatives are female. So I'm not here today to talk to you about why Arab women are less likely to be represented than Arab men. I'm talking about attitudes and behaviors, because women in general in the U.S. aren't represented in Congress. So what do we know more generally about the gender gap in U.S. politics? Well, really, we talk about a gap a lot, but as Ron alluded to, there's not much of a gap on many aspects. The biggest gap between American men and women is in presidential voter preference. And women tend to vote for the Democratic candidate, and men tend to vote for the Republican. So the same thing in 2004, something like 55% of men voted for Bush compared to 48% of women. But in all other things, public policy, consciousness, how aware they are of politics, how important politics is to them, there are very few differences between men and women. Now, I don't have time today to go into the theoretical reasons for this, but just to give you a sort of insight, there are more things that join men and women together than that separate them, surprisingly enough. In other words, there's bigger cleavages between groups, namely ethnic and racial groups in the U.S. or religious groups, say African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, than there are between men and women within any one group. So they're more likely to hold the same attitudes and values on things that affect them as a group rather than divides them as men and women. As one person said, as women, we're either married to men or we're the daughters of men or we have brothers. We're intricately tied to men. So there's not a whole lot of reason to expect to see big cleavages between men and women on sort of daily beliefs and attitudes. So this brings us to the case for Arab Americans, what we might expect in terms of two things that I'm going to focus on today. And the paper actually goes into public policy and other arenas. But given the 20 minutes that I have, I want to focus on two things. The first is just looking at Arab American women's overall degree of participation in the American political system. And then second, looking how different they are from men. And I say there's competing theories because we could expect on the one hand that Arab American women's participation, both overall compared to other women and compared to the men, would be low. Several reasons for this. Here I list a couple. First of all, context of origin. People who research immigrants talk about the fact that we shouldn't treat them as having dropped in from outer space. These people come from somewhere, and where they come from and the context they leave behind matters for their behaviors in the U.S. So we know Arab women's political participation in most parts of the Middle East is relatively low, especially when compared to the U.S. context. So there's no necessary reason to believe that they would come over and all of a sudden be highly politically active. The second thing are gender norms. A lot of research done on the fact that gender role attitudes are linked to political participation just in the population in general. In other words, if you've got questions on it's better to leave the running of the country up to men. So the idea is that the political sphere is inherently public, and that if you believe that the woman's role is in the home, you're going to be less likely to be engaged in that realm. So that's the low part. I would also argue there's reasons to believe that Arab women's participation and engagement in the political arena would be high. Again, just a couple of reasons, and there's many. But on the one hand, we know that selective migration. Immigrants don't come here randomly from their countries of origin. They're often more highly educated, more politically active, more politically conscious, and there's actually empirical research to back this up in the Arab case. So these women may come over with higher levels of political consciousness than the women left behind in their countries of origin. And then the second component is religion. Despite the stereotype that especially Muslim women aren't as active as Muslim men, in the U.S. context, that's not necessarily true. And we know that religious involvement increases political participation, and there have been community studies, namely done by Amani Jamal, that shows that Arab Muslim women are more politically active than their male counterparts, in part because they're more engaged in the mosque, and so they're more conscious. But we really don't know how this looks and plays out on the national scene, so I'm going to look at this as well. So to just summarize 3 questions and then get to sort of the data that I'm going to be looking at. First of all, is there a gender gap in political engagement, attitudes, and behaviors between Arab American men and women? Second, to the extent that there's a gap, what explains it? And not only the usual suspects that are used to explain differences in political engagement in the American context, but most importantly, what the role is of religion and religious identity. How does that affect political engagement? So to look at these questions, I'm going to be drawing on 2 national data sets that were collected in 2001 and 2004. Many of you are probably familiar with these data. They were collected by Georgetown University, Project MAPS, Muslim Americans in Public Spaces, and Zogby International collected the data. The 2 years combined have a total sample size of 3,600, a little over 3,600 cases. But this was a survey of Muslim Americans, so it also includes other ethnic groups other than Arabs. So it has South Asians and African Americans. And today, I'm focusing only on the Arab case just for brevity's purposes. But in other papers, I'm actually comparing Arabs to the South Asians and African Americans in terms of their political engagement. So the Arab subsample's a little over 1,000. And of course, I can give you more on the methodology, but I'll leave that for question and answer. Weights were applied by Zogby to more accurately represent the population. So a little bit about the sample. It's adults 18 and over, so those who could be politically involved. 80% are immigrant, so these are Arab Muslims. An important caveat. Of those immigrants, only 9% have been in the U.S. for less than 10 years. This is not a newly arrived immigrant group. Over 60% have been here 20 years or more. So a more assimilated group, one that might be more politically active. A very well-educated group, 60% have a bachelor's degree or higher. So I couldn't go forward without at least mentioning some of the advantages and limitations, because there are certainly limitations to the data. On the one hand, obviously the data are more representative than any other study that's been done on Muslim Americans to date in terms of the national sampling frame. And it's got rich data on political engagement, over 100 questions in all for the surveys on attitudes, behaviors, public opinion on domestic policy, foreign policy, things that I can't get in here today. But on the downside, which I'll actually argue isn't such a downside, is the fact two things. First of all, secular Muslims are likely underrepresented. In other words, this is probably a more religious sample, partly because the methodology focused on cities with high number of mosque density, partly so they could find enough Muslims to include in the study. And the second thing is Arab Christians aren't included. So this is not just a study of Arab Americans, these are Arab Muslims. I would say both of those things are positive in the sense that on the national scene today, we're most concerned about religious Muslims and where they fit within the American public sphere. We're less concerned about the secular Muslims, and most people don't know they're Arab Christians, and the people that do think they were successful converts from evangelical missionaries. So the idea is, in terms of sort of dispelling myths or challenging stereotypes, our real concern are the more religious Muslims. So in terms of the research question, I would say these limitations actually work in my favor, but that's my job to sell the story, right? Okay, so here what I'm going to do is present some slides to sort of help simplify the data, because it's complicated. And in every one of these slides, the red bar is women, and the green bar is men. And the stars just mean that they're significantly different from each other. And on some of the slides, I'll have ND, which mean they're no different. So I'm going to run through some slides looking at the things I talked about, political attitudes, political behaviors, comparing the Arab Muslim men and women in the sample on these characteristics. So first of all, this is just a simple relationship in terms of party affiliation. And two things we see, first of all, is that women are more likely to affiliate with the Democratic Party, less likely to affiliate with the Republican Party, and there's a significant gap on all these measures, and they look like the national average. Women in the U.S. are more likely to affiliate with the Democratic Party and less likely to affiliate with the Republican Party. As a group, however, one important difference is that Arab American Muslims are more likely to be independents than the national average. So even though the gender gap sort of follows the national average, Americans in general tend to affiliate with the two parties, Republican or Democrat. So let's look at some sort of standard measures on gender consciousness, just like the awareness or how important politics is and how important it is. These are sort of standard questions to sort of gauge how people feel about being involved in the political system. And so what we see here, again, are significant gender differences. In every case, men are slightly more conscious on each of these questions. So, oops. Wrong direction, wrong button. So what we've got here is their responses to how important it is to participate in politics, have children participate in politics, and to closely follow what's going on in government public affairs. So in each case, men are slightly more likely, and it's significantly different. But I would also say these are very high levels of political consciousness in this sample. Over half or nearly half on each of the questions say it's very important. And due to time constraints, I took out the slide, but an important slide that I had in an earlier version of the paper is that there are almost 90 to 95% of Arab Muslim men and women said that Muslims should participate in the political process, they should support non-worthy Muslim candidates, and that they should contribute to non-Muslim social service programs. So the idea that Muslims should be a part of the American political system. Okay, I'm going to skip to this one. So here's a gender gap in activity. Again, what we see are fairly high levels of activity, and again, men are slightly more likely. They're more likely to be registered to vote. they're more likely to have contacted a politician, and they're more likely to have contributed to a campaign. Again, in each one of these cases, significantly different. So I'm going to skip to a regression model, because here's the second part of the talk, what explains this difference. You don't have to be a statistician, because I'm going to walk you through the slide. But what these are is these are OLS regression models that are predicting political consciousness. And I find the same thing for consciousness and activity. And what this is, I've created sort of scales of all these different variables to see how politically conscious men and women are. And then we're going to explain what the difference is. So all this shows in Model 1 is that women are less politically conscious than men, which we saw from the earlier slides on the different variables, but this is sort of a composite measure. So they're significantly less likely to be politically conscious than men, and that this holds after including nativity, duration of residence in the U.S., region, age, sort of some of the usual suspects. In the second model, I include the two main explanatory factors typically thought to contribute to the gender gap, and that's socioeconomic status and education. So here, bachelor's degree or higher, it has a positive effect. In other words, if you're educated and you make a lot of money, you're more likely to be politically conscious. And what we see looking across the models is it explains close to half of the difference between men and women, but women are still less likely to be politically conscious than men after controlling for these factors. The most important model comes in the end, and there's several things to point out here, so I'll try to do it without going too quickly. First of all these variables at the bottom are the religious identity variables. And so what you've got here is that subjective religiosity, how often you pray, how important religion is into your daily life. Importantly, no effect, no significant effect is really minimal. And for political activity, it's negative and slightly significant. Attending the mosque more than once a week, I've coded this in various ways. Frequent attendance has no effect on political consciousness. What matters are these three at the bottom, what I call organizational and political religiosity measures. How involved they are in mosque activities outside of prayer, and whether or not they feel that mosques should express their political views on the U.S. political scene, and whether or not they feel that imams should be able to discuss politics inside of the mosque, so sort of the externalization, the external role the mosque should play, and the internal role that imams should play. Each of these things increases political consciousness, and it explains the gender gap. Men are more likely to hold these views than women, and it's that contributes to sort of the effect of religion on their political consciousness. Okay, same thing happens for activity. Due to time, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's the same pattern. Women less likely, SES explains part but not all, and it's the religious identity effects that matter the most. And here, I'll talk a little bit about this if someone has in Q&A. High subjective religiosity actually has a negative effect on activity, and I think there's two possible explanations for that that I'll get into here in a minute. But I've got, I think, 3 minutes, so I want to sort of summarize. So the more of a bridge than a gap thing, well, that comes from the fact that both Arab American Muslim men and women are politically active. So it's not just that there's not a gap, but overall as a group, they have high levels of political consciousness and high levels of activity, which I call a bridge because they look more like other U.S. ethnic groups than they do different, sort of what Ron sort of finished with, boringly normal. And it challenges stereotypes of sort of the idea that being Muslim is antithetical to sort of being a participant in the American political system. Like I just showed, women are slightly less involved than men regardless of the measure, and this is explained mainly by differences in their socioeconomic statuses and their religious identity. And I want to end on this sort of this religious identity because I think this is probably most important. And that is that the subjective identity, how important being a Muslim is to you and how often you pray, and frequent attendance at a mosque had very weak effects. And I think there are two implications to this. The first is that being a devout Muslim doesn't necessarily dampen political engagement, and there's debate about this in the literature because on the one hand, there's the question of, well, if you're a good Muslim, should you engage in non-Islamic political activities or non-Islamic political systems? And here it shows at least those two measures do not dampen political engagement. The second, and sort of the stereotype question, is it doesn't seem that being devout incites political reactivism. It's not like, well, I'm a devout Muslim, so I'm going to be very hyper politically active. And the second part, which this really follows and suggests that Muslim Americans are very similar to other ethno-religious groups. These are the components of religious identity that matter the most for other groups in terms of its being a source of mobilization, the extent to which you feel your religious group should work on behalf of your population, and also how involved you are in activities outside of just prayer. And I think, is my time up? I'll just finish with this slide.
One more.
Because we've mentioned it here today several times. The other thing I'm doing, but not in this paper, is looking at the difference in Muslim American attitudes towards domestic and foreign policy and seeing how much those are related. Sort of because we've talked a lot about, well, the factionalization within the Arab American community over the Arab-Israeli issue versus how much organizations should be focusing on Arab-Muslim problems here in the U.S. context. So there's a lot of questions on that. And then I'm also with the Carnegie Foundation, perhaps going to be fielding a survey in 2007 and 2008 as a follow-up to the 2001-2004 surveys. Thank you.
3 excellent papers. Any questions? Comments? Yes.
Will Amatruda, Columbus School of Law. My question is for Professor Stockton. Did you look at religious differences in your Detroit Arab American survey? Because I didn't see it in your charts. Also, how would you respond to the stereotype that some Americans have that Christian Arabs are long established in the country, over 100 years sometimes, a very high rate of marriage outside the group? I've seen figures as high as 80%, whereas Muslim Arabs, much more recent, much more endogamous. And second of all, how do you define Iraqi Kurds? Do you call them Arabs because they come from a predominantly Arab country, or do you exclude them because Arabic is not their first language?
Regarding the study, we have quite a few questions on religion. When I first talked I had some email communication with Janan, and she said, be sure to study religion. It's going to tell you a lot. I ran out of time and space, so I did not include that in this paper. We're right now preparing a book, which I hope will be sent off to the publisher by the end of the summer, and a whole chapter is going to deal with that. I'm working on foreign policy attitudes, and I have found that religion is playing a definite role in shaping foreign policy attitudes. I don't want to talk beyond what I know myself, but I think that religion is emerging as a major distinction. 2/3 of all the Muslims in southeast Michigan, as I said, live within about 5 miles of my house in Dearborn. And there are almost no Christians in that ethnic enclave. Likewise, you've got Detroit, you've got the river, and then you've got, right here is Dearborn, and then around here you have the suburbs. The Christians live mostly in the suburbs. The Muslims live disproportionately in the inner ring suburbs rather than the outer ring suburbs. I think it's emerging as a definite a distinction. And what was the other point you made where I was going to say it's different? Oh, the Iraqi Kurds, sorry, we didn't extend our study to Germany. And we don't have, I'm making a joke here, we don't have many Iraqi Kurds. So we've got, I did have a student once who was an Iraqi Kurd, and he showed me that his ear was missing. He said Saddam had cut it off. So they have their stories, but they're not large in numbers. We did we did include them in the study because we were interested in people who came from an Arab country, regardless of what they considered themselves. We then asked them, do you consider yourself an Arab American or not? And we gave them options. And what we discovered is a large number, not a majority certainly, preferred some other term. And when we checked to see which term they preferred, they gave us over 100 different answers. So it's not as if there's, Arab and I'm a something else. This then goes forever, like I'm a Lebanese American, or whatever, I'm a Chaldean Iraqi American. It just goes on forever. Everybody's got their own specific little category. So most people feel comfortable with the term Arab American in some way, but there are elements that do not.
Back there.
Yeah, my question is, since can I pronounce your name like Ghazal? Yeah. You discuss, in order to take and analyze these statistics, I'm sure that you discuss these questions with a lot of Muslims. My question is how to talk these Muslims into politics without bringing religion into picture. They are so emotional that you talk about being part of American political system, and immediately these people bring Islam into picture. It's very difficult to isolate that. Is there any way to talk with them without bringing Islam into picture? Or what are the other ways to reach them and to activate them or to motivate them to become a part of political process in these states, besides going to mosque? I mean, there are some people who don't feel comfortable with the religion or with mosque because it's too much religion. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to talk with them on any issue in depth without bringing Islam into picture. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe keep the microphone close in case I misunderstood the question. In part, the study at least contains secular Muslims as well. So, I mean, they're highly politically active. The point being that being religiously active isn't antithetical to being politically active in the American system. In terms of bringing in people and making them more politically active without bringing Islam in, I don't know if you can do that. I mean, for those who consider religious identity to be one of their primary identities, it's very hard for them to separate, and I think it might be counterproductive to try to do that. I see the question more as trying to how to do both at the same time.
It's not counterproductive. I'm asking this because a couple of weeks ago I took some Pakistani American physician on the hill to talk with congressional staff, and these people who have medical degree from Pakistan, they will start talking about Allah. You know, it's totally seems very strange that you are talking on the hill with staff about Allah. I mean, you came here to raise some of your own issues about student visa. You're not here to preach Islam, and neither they are going to face you very friendly terms. I mean, you have to understand the environment, political environment where those people operate. People don't want to listen about Islam religion, especially on these kind of political institutions. But these people should have little bit sense that, you know, they should talk about their issues, political or educational or cultural issues, rather than teaching them Islam going on the hill.
Well, then I understand your question, and I'm the wrong person to ask. They may have learned from the evangelicals and see that it works for them, and so they think, well, maybe if we do the same thing. I'm sure there's other people in the room who can answer that more appropriately.
No, this lady down there. Yes. And then next you.
Thank you. I'm really fascinated with this because I'm an Asian American researcher and have been in the pre-civil rights and post-civil rights. And I think what I'm seeing you do, and I'm very impressed that you are raising our awareness from both a social science perspective as well as a civic participation one, because we've been stuck in the 19th and 20th century models of, you know, who is a citizen and what is a community. And what I see you doing, and I've just finished a study based on 4 generations of Filipino-American native-born versus the post-65 ones, and I'm seeing the same things, which is basically we are moving towards a 21st century model of what is a democracy, who is a U.S. citizen, and how do we fit in a global village. And the idea of religion is critical because, you know, our civil rights rules really talk about race, color, creed and national origin, and people seem to forget that that was really kind of crucial, particularly when this was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. And so what I want to ask you is, what do you see in terms of what are going to be the 2 or 3 things that you see to teach 21st century researchers, whether they be political scientists or sociologists or economists, about how do you do research in a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic United States that has ties to the rest of the world?
I'll take a stab.
Go first?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and the thing for me is to try to get at what the mechanisms are, and that's why my question, the first thing this morning was Professor Gersel, is, well, what helped the Irish and Catholicism? I knew time was going to be a part of the answer, but in the Muslim case, it's an ongoing, like, has the clock started yet? Because as long as 9/11 and the Iraqi war, do we have to wait for all of that to end for the clock to restart, or is it a constant? So trying to figure out what the mechanisms are. For me, social science is about, like, figuring out what other people have done for other groups and seeing the extent to which it applies to the current group and how we can build on it. That's where I was trying to go with the religious identity part. We've had a lot about this religious participation increases political participation, but oddly enough, we never apply that to Muslims. And then when we do it in a very sort of a facile way. Well, attending the mosque. Well, I think there's more dimensions of that, especially when you assess gender differences. Going to the mosque means different things to men and women. You know, being very involved in mosque means different things to men and women. So trying to figure out what are the mechanisms for one group and seeing if it applies to other groups. And in that sense, having more of the global village feel, that these groups aren't in isolation, but yet they share similar experiences and maybe similar traits, or maybe different, that we can learn from.
I would, there are two things here, two questions, and I'll address them both. First, what I tried to do in this paper is to link analysis of Arab Americans into the things that social scientists know about people who are not Arab Americans. I think that's an area that researchers need to consider. I think they've not done enough of, they've been so anxious to break with what they see as inadequate models that they've not recognized how much value can come out of looking at research that has to do with national trends and patterns. Secondly, the question you're raising also is, what's the appropriate analogy? Is there anything comparable to Arab Americans? In my paper, and I hope you'll send me an email, I'll send you a copy of it, I suggest that maybe, I have a little supplementary essay at the end of my paper addressing this very issue. I think maybe look at Germans 100 years ago. Because Germans came from a country where they brought their culture and their religion with them, but they didn't bring any national identity, really. They were not welcome. Their country just didn't want them, really, to have any political input. They were from, there was no Germany. So they came from Bavaria and Rhineland and whatever it was, and they had those little regional identities which kept them really from interacting with each other. They didn't share a religion. There were Catholics and Protestants, and that's as big as Christian Muslim today in those days. So I think that's worth considering. You know, how did the Germans deal with it, and what does that have to do with the Arabs today? I think that might be. I think we're being uncreative in the analogies that we're looking at, and so I would suggest more creative historical analogies might be a way to go. Oh, by the way, I did want to mention, follow up on your question. Nationally, the Christians came first to this place. In 1885, you had a church in Worcester, Massachusetts. But in the Detroit area, Muslims were there as early as the Christians. 100 years ago, we had particularly Shia Muslims in southeast Michigan. So southeast Michigan is a little bit different from the national pattern.
My name is Riyas Naqshbandi. I'm from Sangamore Group. I think in 2 words or less, I think the presentations were fast. My question is basically related to the assessment, if any. Is it working? Okay. The assessment, if any, about for a person to identify himself as being a Muslim and an Arab, depending upon the general political atmosphere. For example, you mentioned earlier that recently the latest poll indicated that X percentage of Americans, they don't trust Muslims or they don't trust Islam and so on. From your research, have you addressed that particular question of identifying a person, if he is a Muslim or not, according to the political climate at that time? Thank you.
Is the question whether or not Muslims change their identification based on situational context? As far as I know, there's no research that can actually that's been done to figure that out. I mean, in earlier research, I did some ethnographic work on Arab Americans and asked them how they identified themselves in a host of different situations. For example, if they applied for a bank loan or if they were applying for a private school for their children versus a neighbor or someone else in the church. And it certainly differed based on these situations, but there were rare, very rare circumstances where they denounced being Arab or Muslim. It was always more the specificity. Well, if it's someone else in my mosque or church, I tell them I'm Syrian, my parents are this, versus if it's a neighbor, I just say I'm Arab, just sort of a pan-ethnic term, but never really denouncing. Especially if anything, the term reactive ethnicity comes into play. They become more, staunchly Muslim or Arab to sort of show that they're a good person and they're this thing that people think is so bad.
let me just comment on this quickly. Sure. I think we social scientists and maybe political organizers make the same mistake, that we assume that categories are fixed. And in fact, your identities shift from wherever you are and what the situation and context is. I remember, I mean, I got a lot of anecdotes. I don't have any data, but I remember last year I was talking to a group of students after class, and I said, do all of you think you're Arabs? This is what I wanted to know. And this one Lebanese Catholic said, well, of course I'm an Arab, but Americans assume that Arab means Muslim, so for the sake of my religion, I have to call myself Lebanese, but of course I'm an Arab. Now, what does that mean in terms of who she is and how she would answer my survey? I mean, and how you could organize her. I think we need to get rid of our simple categories. I think life is too complex to fit everybody into a category. Our categories don't fit, and sometimes they deceive us.
This gentleman right there. Thank you. Marwan Bergan. As a political practitioner, I guess, for the past 20 years, and also trained in social sciences, I have a couple of questions for you. From my data in Fairfax County, it seems that Arab American participation, Muslim American participation, drops from 67.6% in presidential election down to 15.6% in local elections. That's school board, county. So I have a question here. Does understanding the personal benefits of politics increases political participation? Because it seems to me, as an Arab American, I'm an immigrant, you know, our organization has focused a lot around foreign issues, foreign policy. Yes, civil rights have come into play, but still, I don't see in people understanding. I'll give a quick example. A hurricane hits, Fairfax County, and none of the callers who called, 300 so callers, were Arab American or even, immigrant. Second question is, it seems to me your data is based on self-disclosure method, right, a survey method. And I'm not sure to what extent there's an exaggeration there of somebody saying, yes, I vote or I give money, versus whether they do that in reality or not. So is there any way to verify that data by looking maybe at voter records? Third is political participation. You keep on defining it as voting, giving money, and calling your congressman. But there's another aspect there that's very important, which is party participation, party membership, being precinct leaders or captains, as well as getting involved in GOTV and getting out the vote. I mean, that's what empowerment is. But it seems to me that traditional political science doesn't go enough into looking at these issues. Thank you.
Some of those things don't lend themselves to survey research. You're absolutely right. There's no way to tell. I've got so many former students who are involved in organizing and activities that it's amazing, and yet they didn't get included in my study. So I think that's a legitimate point about survey research, that it can't answer these other questions, which are very, very important questions to answer. What was the other point you made that is important? Oh, regarding the fall off of voting in national elections versus local elections, that's a common pattern. There are times when you get 15% turnout in a school board election, so the fact that Arab Americans are indifferent to that, no big surprise there. In a sense, that's boringly normal.
I would
actually, this gentleman right here to the left.
Ismail Ahmed. Just wanted to talk a little bit about two things that have come up a little bit and ask a question related to it. One is, I think that, since September 11th, to some extent there's been assumptions about Muslim Americans, and so we study them more, we look more at them, and we make assumptions about them. But I don't know, in my history of organizing and what I've seen around the United States, most of the political organizing has been Arab American organizing versus Muslim American organizing. And I think the number, now that's not to say that that's not a growing trend. And the other related thing, though, that I'd like to get more at is, I think it's more complicated than whether they're Arab American or Muslim American, but there are a bunch of things that hover around this. For instance, what is the role of nationality in that, or historic nationality and so forth? Could you talk about those things that hover around participation?
Anybody in particular?
I mean, I could add that although it seems that the audience is exceptionally interested in statistics, I could jump in terms of my ethnographic background. In one of the articles I've published recently, it's called Muslim First, Arab Second, A Strategic Politics of Race and Gender, which is an analysis of youth activists at UC Berkeley, at the University of California, Berkeley, and San Francisco State University. And what I found was that there was an emerging movement among student activists that is also a national trend for young people, and this isn't the only trend, there are many other identity trends, to disaggregate the category Arab from the category Muslim and craft an identity that they refer to as Muslim first, Arab second. And the historical context and political context isn't because they're just so happen to decide to be more Muslim or more religious, and it wasn't always about their relationship to God or to the divine, but it had to do with the fact that the category Muslim provided them with a broader context for building coalition on campus, claiming their rights. It had also become a more visible category on the level of the nation, national, kind of discourses. And also, it interestingly provided more space for young people to negotiate gender ideals that their parents kind of imposed on them. So women and men married across racial lines and made arguments that there's no color in Islam for a woman Syrian to marry an African-American Muslim or others. So I think I agree with you, there are all kinds of different factors that come into play. Class, I think, is an issue. And even in, I'm interested in when it comes to bringing together the ethnographic material with the statistical work, because in my work on the aftermath of September 11th, I found, as many of you know, that a lot of people are living in an intensified culture of fear, which makes it very difficult to participate in questionnaires and surveys and answer questions about, do you participate in politics? Do you consider yourself an American? So I would be curious to know how you dealt with or that context of fear and how, what that tells you about how people answered questions the way that they did.
Well, I mean, part of that's going to come into sample selection. The people who are most fearful probably didn't answer the survey at all. And I mean, that's something you just can't account for, especially 2001, 2004, and, there's attempts to talk about, well, who are we missing? But among those in the sample, there are questions on discrimination, and I can certainly stratify and look and see where the people who felt the most discriminated against answering differently than others. I guess let me make 2 points about this. First is one of the most important parts of, and I think we always get into this quandary of how many ways can we slice the pie. The most important thing to me about these studies, and I'm just piggybacking on the great work done by Georgetown and Maps, I'm just using their data, is to try to demystify a group that has been here for a while and that we know a lot more about than we pretend to have access to data to do. And one of the things about the paper is that Muslim Americans look a lot like other ethno-religious populations in terms of the factors that contribute to their political engagement. I think that's an important point to be made. Does it vary by national origin? Of course. I mean, different groups have more at stake, but it also varies by social class, by gender. And one of the problems with the data is that there's not enough people from these different countries. And then I go to the ethnographic stuff, and that's even worse. So I go to a mosque in Houston and to a church, and then I have 2 people that are Lebanese and 2 that are Palestinian. And what's that tell me about national origin differences? So it's a quandary, and not one that's not important, but I'm not sure at this level, until there's more data available that's more representative of all these different countries, what to do with that. I mean, there are certainly national origin differences. There are certainly those who are more assimilated, who want nothing to do with sort of the foreign policy, which is why I said the foreign domestic policy split is something I want to look at next. That's, definitely the case where there's different national origin groups who are more concerned about things in the Middle East than they are about domestic policy.
There are 2 sets of questions here. Ish's question about organization and Nadine's question about distrust and validity, basically. In terms of political organization, I have never met anybody I know that knows more about that than Ish. So he's my expert on that. But I just do want to just talk about this complexity of identity and just give you the story of my own campus, where we have had for 20 years an Arab students organization. We're now getting the Yemeni students organization, and you know, they're breaking away. For a time, they had a big fight about 15 years ago, and they agreed to have 5 presidents instead of 1, representing the big 5 of our multicultural Arab population. And now, then a few years ago, they had a breakaway. The Muslim students broke away. And now we have Sunni and Shia, separate Muslim associations. So we got the Arab students, we got the Sunni Muslims, we got the Shia Muslims, we got the Yemenis, and who knows what else. There's a Chaldean association as well. So we got at least 5, maybe 6 different organizations on campus representing this complex mix of populations. Now, regarding the validity of responses, this has intrigued me a lot, and I'm writing something on it right now. Let me just say a couple things. First, that we had an exceptionally low rejection rate. Our acceptance rate was into the 70s. It was about, the acceptance rate in the Arab American community was close to 20% higher than in the general population. So those people who say, well, the Arabs will never talk to you, that's not what we found. We found that I was manning the phones, and I was getting phone calls saying, I want to be included. And I was saying, sorry, we got a random sampling. We can't include anybody, but you know, the Lord chose, and you're not included. But secondly, we asked people, we had the interviewer fill out, was the person nervous or uneasy during the interview? Now, you always got a lot of people. I remember when I was a graduate student and the professor had us go out and interview people. I remember interviewing this one person, a family. They just sat there. They answered every question I asked them. And at the end, they said, did we do it right? You know, I mean, there's always people, when a highly educated person comes in and starts interviewing you, it's intimidating. We found that about 14% felt that they were uneasy. I've been analyzing who those 14% were, and I don't see any real patterns there. I don't see very much about who the nervous ones were. I think it's a random nervousness that occurs when you think they're going to, you know, you might get the answer wrong and the professor is going to mark you down or something. We checked this with crosstabs. We checked this by saying, are the nervous ones different from the ones, I mean, if the nervous ones are those who have less education, then we know the answer, don't we? If the nervous ones are those who are very highly politically active, then we know the answer, don't we? They're concealing something. And basically, they're the people who would be intimidated in a survey.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Sorry, we ran out of time. I would like to remind you of the next panel, panel number 4, on political participation with Helen Samhan and Kathy Christensen at 3:30 in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much. That was great. Well, we were quite
yeah, thanks.
Which I will get to for my sister. She lives in San Francisco.